Welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic, that is concept of supply. Understanding concept of supply is very important to learn the GST law, because only if any transaction falls within the definition of supply, only then GST liability arises. Otherwise, there is no GST liability at all. If any transaction doesn't pass the test of scope of supply, that is enshrined under Section 7 of the GST Act, CGST Act, and respective acts of GST of respective states. In that case, if the transaction doesn't come within the ambit of scope of supply, in that case, there is no GST liability at all until that is covered under the exceptions of that subsection. We can easily say that the whole edifice of GST law is built upon the concept of supply. The supply is the most important terminology in GST law. If any transaction falls under the definition, then only GST is applicable on that transaction, subject to certain other explanations, provisos, exceptions, etc. Now, to learn a law, to learn anything, to read anything, to understand anything, the best way to learn is we must try to know the intention of the legislatures, because the legislatures enact a law, draft a law for a certain purpose. So, to know the intention of the legislature, the best way to learn is we must go through the act which is notified by the government. Now, a rule which is very important to know, rule of literal construction says whatever in the law, if the provisions which is under the law is clear and we can take the meaning as per their words, then we shouldn't apply any other rule. So the literal construction, that is also known as golden rule of interpretation, we must follow that rule until and unless it is very important, it is must to go for the other interpretations. So I feel we must go through the section 7 that defines scope of supply under GST. Scope of supply, we want to know, we just try to know what is the scope of supply, means what are the transactions that can be covered, that are covered by GST law under the scope of supply. So first we go through the exact language of the act, then we would try to understand the meaning of the legislature, the meaning of the provisions. Section 7, subsection 1 says, for the purpose of this act, the expression supply includes all forms of supply of goods or services or both, such as sale, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, or disposal made or agreed to be made for a transaction, for a consideration by a person in the course of furtherance of business. So it is clear here that the definition of supply is inclusive, because it is written in the subsection 1 that the expression supply includes. It means in the definition of supply, these all transactions would be included. Now it is clear here, like earlier laws, service tax law, excise law, weight law, there were different kind of taxable events in all those acts. But now in GST, there is only a taxable event, which is supply. So when the supply occurs as per GST law, when the time of supply occurs as per GST law, then at that point of time, GST liability arises on the assessee taxpayers. And it is clear here, if any transaction, if any goods is not transferred, in means the title of goods, if it is not transferred, even then, without transferring title of goods, GST levy arises, because all forms of supply of goods or services are included in the scope of supply, transfer, barter, exchange, license, rental, lease, or disposal. What are the meanings of this terminology? We will discuss the meaning of this terminology in the next slides. Now, the subsection 1, clause B says, import of services for a consideration, whether or not in the course or furtherance of business. In the course of furtherance of business. That means, in the clause A, we read that to form a supply, it is must that there must be a consideration, and that should be in the course of furtherance of business. But in clause B, it is said import of service for a consideration. If import of service is not in the course of furtherance of business, even then GST liability arises on such transaction. That means it is the exception of the clause A. Now the another exception is, which is there in clause C, the activities specified in schedule 1 made or agreed to be made without a consideration. What clause C says? This is also exception of clause A, wherein it is said that the supply should be made or agreed to be made for a consideration, and that should be in the course of furtherance of business. In clause B, we have read import of service. If it is not in the course of furtherance of business, even then it is under the scope of supply. The clause C says the activities specified in schedule 1. Schedule 1 is schedule 1 of the CGST Act and respective state GST Acts. If that activity is specified in schedule 1 made or agreed to be made without consideration, even then that would be covered under the scope of supply, because the general rule says that consideration must be there and that should be for the furtherance of business. But these exceptions says that if import of service is there, that is if that is not in the furtherance of business, then also it would be covered in the scope of supply. And the activities specified in schedule 1, if they are not made without consideration, even then they would be covered under the scope of supply. The next slide says section 1A, subsection 1A of section 7, wherein it is said, where certain activities or transactions constitute a supply in accordance with the provisions of subsection 1, they shall be treated either as supply of goods or supply of services as referred to in schedule 2. Now schedule 2 says that there are certain transactions and the lawmakers defined like these supplies would be considered as supply of goods and these supplies would be considered as supply of service. This is very important. Like there are many transactions wherein supply of goods and supply of services both are involved. We may take an example, like if works contract service means we are the contractor and we are executing the works wherein we are also supplying the material and providing labor or services also. So what should be said? What should that supply be covered? Where that supply should be covered? Whether that should be covered in the supply of goods or in the category of supply of services. So to remove the difficulties, to remove the ambiguity, lawmakers defined in schedule 2 that these activities would be termed as supply of goods and these activities would be termed as supply of services. So if a transaction, we may feel that that transaction is supply of service, but if it is defined as supply of goods in schedule 2, then irrespective of any other interpretation, that would be covered in such category. So schedule 2 says that. Now subsection 2, notwithstanding anything contained in subsection 1. Here I would like to tell you what is the meaning of notwithstanding, because you have read this terminology at many places in many books. Notwithstanding means this is a superseding clause, like whether other clauses say something different, or other section, other provisions say something different, even then the provisions which are mentioned following this terminology would supersede all other transactions. Means here what is written, that should be applicable and that should be supersede all other transactions. So I read it again. Notwithstanding anything contained in subsection 1, means in subsection 1 whatever we have said, but irrespective of that, activities or transactions specified in schedule 3 or such activities or transactions undertaken by the central government, state government, or any other local authority in which they are engaged as public authorities, as may be notified by the government on the recommendations of the council, shall be treated neither as a supply of goods nor a supply of services. Means government has the power, the lawmakers gave the power to the government that they can define, they can notify that certain supplies would not be constituted as supply of goods and supply of services. So if the government is notified that such transactions are not covered in the definition of supply, then that would not be covered under the definition of supply. Here it is. Here I would like to tell you one more thing, because it is written here. So I would try to explain you this terminology also. Here it is written, as may be notified by the government on the recommendations of the council. Friends, this should be very clear to all of us that in GST law, the GST council is most powerful and all the decisions are taken in the council and not by the government. Most important part of GST is like all the state government and center both sits together and then they take decisions in the council meetings. And as per the recommendation of the council, government issues the notifications. So this is relevant for the further reading. So I explained you here. The next is subsection 3 of sections 3(7) is subject to the provisions of subsection 1, 1A and 2. The government may, on the recommendations of the council, specify by notification the transactions that are to be treated as a supply of goods and not as supply of services, or a supply of service and not as supply of goods. As we have discussed, the government has the power to notify the transactions, and without any other opinion or any other interpretation, that would be considered as supply of services or supply of goods as specified by the government. This is the definition of law which is mentioned. The important thing is the definition of supply is not there, but scope of supply is there in the GST Act, and which defines that these are the categories of supply which would constitute supply for the GST law. Now let's discuss. This is a tabular view of supply under GST. Supply includes sale, transfer, exchange, barter, license, rental, lease, and disposal. These 8 terms are included in the definition of supply, and that should be in the course of furtherance of business, and that should be for the consideration. But there are some exceptions which we have read. Now the next slide is elements of supply. Like supply is done for a consideration. Supply is done for a consideration means, here is an example, like Sangeeta provides free of cost canteen services to Bharat NGO. This is not considered as supply under GST because there is no consideration in this transaction, and the exception given in the law also doesn't cover this situation. The exception is when the activities are covered under the schedule 1, then only without consideration also that would be covered under supply. But these services which Sangeeta is providing is not covered in the schedule 1. Second is supply is done in course or furtherance of business. I also tell you here the furtherance of business. What is furtherance of business? There is no word in the law furtherance of business. It is not defined in the law, but it is generally used something which is for the business, which is for the promotion of business, and which is for the running of the business, which is essential for the business. That is called furtherance of business. For example, Mr. Viren, a lawyer, sales of his personal car for rupees 2 lakhs. This is not done in the course of his business. Means Mr. Viren is a lawyer. His services are related to the legal opinions, appearance before the court, etc. But he doesn't deal in the sale and purchase of the cars. But when he sells his personal car for some consideration, then it was not done in the course of his business. Therefore, this transaction is not covered within the scope of supply. So any transaction that doesn't contain these elements is not considered as a supply. The next is, we have read the 8 terms in the scope of supply. Section 7.1 defines supply includes this. So what does the term mean? Let us read this. Sale, transfer of ownership of goods. It is very clear, it is very common. When ownership of goods is transferred, then that transaction is called sale. Transfer of goods, rights in goods without transfer of title. When the transfer takes place without transfer of title, then it is called transfer. In the legal term, barter, exchange one commodity with another without money. If money is involved, then that would not defined as a barter. That would be defined as exchange. When one person is giving some goods and one person is doing something, one person is giving some money. One is transferring something and second is transferring in money. Then that would cover under the definition of exchange. License, a permission granted to exercise, enjoy certain privileges. Students, these terms are taken from the Transfer of Property Act 1882, wherein license, lease, these terms are defined, but it is not so relevant for us. It is sufficient for us to know the basic meaning of these terms. Now, the next term is rental, periodic payment for the use of someone else's property, that is rental. Lease, contract to allow right to use for a period without transfer of title. So in rental and lease are sometimes used in place of each other. But rental is something when the transaction is the nature of periodic payment, where the terms and condition are like one person will pay periodic payment to another. That is called generally rental. And lease, it is for the long term, it is for the long run, and that is without transfer of title. That is also in rental. But this is a thin line of difference between rental and lease. When the transaction is periodically, there is a agreement, there is a condition that periodic payment would be made, then it is considered as rental, otherwise lease. Disposal, like when somebody transfers his assets, his businesses, that is called disposal. Let us take an example. Like a person is manufacturing goods, manufacturing stones, and he purchases some machineries. After using these machineries, he wants to transfer these machineries free of cost to somebody. Like he uses some machinery for personal purpose, and that is given to the NGO after using in the business. So there is no consideration at all for that transaction, but still, because of this definition, that would include in the term of disposal, and there would be liability of GST, and that would constitute as supply. Now, exception to elements of supply, we have already understood this term, but still we have to go through the schedule. What are the elements? What are the activities which are defined, which are mentioned under Schedule 1, and the activities which are defined under Schedule 1, if they are done without consideration, even then that would constitute as a supply. And second, supply to be done in the course or furtherance of business. This is when import of goods, services with consideration is considered as supply, whether for personal business use. Like for import of service, if it is not in the course of furtherance of business, even then that would be considered as supply. And the activities which are defined in Schedule 1, if they are done without consideration, even then that would be covered under the scope of supply. Now, to understand the scope of supply, we have to go through the Schedule 1. What are the transactions defined there and what is their meaning? There are majorly 4 transactions defined under deemed supply that would be considered as supply. And there are certain other terms which we need to understand the scope of supply, like the types of supply, intrastate supply, interstate supply, the composite supply, mixed supply, what are these, and many other things are there, many other ingredients are there, which are very important, very important to understand the term supply. So, but because of restriction of time, we have to conclude this video here. And in the next video, we will discuss all the provisions thoroughly. Thank you very much for watching me. If you have any query, you can ask me anytime. I'll give you the time slot. In that time slot, you can raise the questions. Thank you so much, students.